Welcome back everyone to more NASCAR Heat 4 at Knee Pit Gaming. Today's setup video is going to be about one of my absolute favorite NASCAR tracks, and that's Bristol Motor Speedway. We're going to be talking about the Cup cars as well as Xfinity and trucks. I can't wait to get started, so let's get to it. One of the big changes for the physics in NASCAR Heat 4 is the addition of tire wear. Now, tire wear is going to have a huge effect on the setup that you're running, so it makes sense that we need to, before we get into setup discussion, talk a little bit about the options that I use while I'm testing for these setups. So we'll start off in the options menu under the gameplay tab, and then we're going to scroll down to tire wear and fuel consumption. Normally I do this on 2x. I don't like to go any higher because I do like long green flag runs, but I understand that some of you like to go all the way up to 4x. Player tire wear rate, I like more wear. I like maximum tire wear, so I generally test on more wear and less grip under the grip fall off. So keep that in mind. If you're playing with different settings such as less wear and more grip, then that's going to change the setup that you're going to want to use in the races. So keep that in mind as we're talking about setups. What I'll try to do in each video is let you know the particular settings, because I don't go for maximum tire wear at every track, just where I feel that it is appropriate. And also keep in mind, on the driving tab, there is a setting that you'll need to match up for the AI. So if you want maximum tire wear, then you need to have that on both the player car and the AI car. Or if you're going for less tire wear and more grip, then change that for the AI as well. Before we jump into the setup discussion, let's first talk a little bit about tire wear and lap times. Now, the case at Bristol, much like it's going to be at the majority of the tracks in NASCAR Heat 4 for me, I focused almost entirely on long run speed. I spent very little time trying to get qualifying speed or single lap speed. Instead, I focused on long runs and keeping the tires under me for an entire fuel run. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the lap times. In the Cup cars, I'm somewhere around a 15.4 on the quicker laps. Xfinity is about a 15.7, and then trucks somewhere around a 16 flat, 16.1. Anywhere in that range on each of the three series should have you either starting up front or very close to the front. So with that in mind, now let's move on to the setups. My goal for each of the setups that we're going to see in today's video between Cup, Xfinity, and trucks is to show you a couple of different ways to accomplish the very same thing, meaning that all three of these setups are going to be very similar. However, there are going to be some subtle tweaks that can really help the car rotate a little bit better or keep the car tighter, just depending on your preference. So again, multiple ways of trying to accomplish the same goal, which is ultimately to be fast over an entire fuel run, particularly if you're using maximum tire wear and grip fall off. We'll start with the shock settings. Nothing really surprising here. 5.7 in the front, 3.5 to the rear, which feels really good for me. As always though, you can use quite a bit stiffer shocks in the front, up to 10, 15 or so. If you so desire, that will make the reactions of the car and the transitions a lot quicker. So if you're interested in that, then that will certainly fit the bill for you. Moving on to the weight settings, 51.5% front weight and 54% wedge. The high wedge number really helps to keep the car stable and keeps it from over rotating, particularly on corner entry and the center of the corner. If you're having a lot of trouble getting the car to rotate, one of the options you have is to reduce that wedge. And if you're really tight or really loose on entry in particular, then adjusting that front weight will help with that. Lowering the front weight will help the car turn better on entry. Increasing the front weight will tighten the car up on entry. So you got a lot of options to tighten or loosen the car at different portions on the track, and the weight settings are one way to do that. Spring settings, 1,000 pound left front, 800 pounds in the right front, and the difference there is really all about getting the car to rotate on entry without over rotating it. 800 pounds in the right front really helps me with that. If I needed a little bit more rotation on entry to the corner, then I would drop that right front spring to maybe 750, maybe even 700 or so, and test that out and see how it worked. Again, we're thinking long term with this setup. So it's not just about what it does at the beginning of the run, it's what it does in the middle and then the end of the run as well. Moving to the rear of the car, 350 pounds in the left rear, 400 pounds in the right rear. I have dropped the springs in the rear simply to try to help keep the right rear under me for a long green flag run. So I tend to wear the right rear more than anything, simply because I prefer the car to keep turning over the course of a run, which generally uses the right rear more. So I've dropped the rear springs a little bit to try to help out some with that. Of course, you can drop them even further or reduce the split between the left rear and the right rear, something like maybe a 350 in the left rear or a 370 in the right rear. Narrow up that split and it will really help to save that right rear tire. Tire settings, 15 and 17 on the lefts, 37 and 34 on the rights, and those seem to work out pretty good. It's not necessarily perfect inflation numbers, but they seem to work out really well and handle nicely. Moving on to the miscellaneous settings, +3 and -3 on the camber. You can certainly use a lot of different values here, as with every track, and have them work, but +3, -3 seem to work the best while allowing for some tire wear issues as well as grip. Moving on to the front sway bar, 1.15 inches. And I can tell you, this is one of the very quick and easy ways to transform a setup. For example, if I try this setup out and I find out that it's just too loose over a longer run, the right rear tire starts to give up and I start to slip and slide coming off the corner. Come in here and increase this sway bar up to 1.315 and try that. It should tighten the car up nicely, particularly over a long run. So in NASCAR Heat 4, I'm finding that very small tweaks can really transform a car and take it from really tight to really loose, or vice versa. Moving on to the track bar, it is fairly low for what I traditionally use. It is 8 inches on the left side, 9 inches on the right side. The right side being a little bit higher to help me on corner exit. But of course, if you find that the car is too loose, particularly on the long run, then drop the track bar, and in particular the right side of the track bar, to tighten it up. Brake bias, I'm anywhere from mid-60s up to around 71 or 72. This is generally about as high as I will take it, but I did want to give you guys that range that I normally operate within. And this is going to come down to personal preference, how much you use the brake. At Bristol, I can run this track without using any brake at all in clean track, or I can choose to drag the brake a little bit, particularly on entry, to help the car rotate. Just a few different ways of doing that, and you'll need to adjust the brake bias depending on how you approach it. Increasing the brake bias will put more front brake in it and tighten the car under braking. Reducing the brake bias will do the opposite effect and actually loosen it under braking. So it's a really good tool to use in a lot of different situations. Moving on to the grill tape, unfortunately, really doesn't do much. The only thing you need to really care about here is don't let the car overheat on you. And 35% should be well within the range that is perfectly safe for that. Wheel lock at 10 degrees, steering offset at 0.05. Both of those are very standard for me. Again, if I were going to use a lot more front camber, which is probably not going to be the case very often, but if I were to do that, then I might increase the steering offset just to help with the pull to the left that all that camber creates. Finally, moving on to the gear settings. 463 rear end gear is by no means your only option here. You can use anything from 471, 486, just depending on how aggressive you are with the throttle pedal. The more RPMs you're turning, the more it's going to use those rear tires, so be aware of that. And also, of course, your driving style. The more aggressive you are on and off the gas, whether you're using it as an on-off switch, where you go from completely off of it to full throttle all at one time, then you're going to need to adjust the rear end ratio for those longer runs to keep the rear tires under you. So that takes care of the Cup setup. Now let's move over to Xfinity. We won't need to spend very much time here in the Xfinity car or in the truck because we've already talked about all of these settings. So I just want to look at a few things that are a little bit different in both Xfinity and trucks. And we'll start out in the weight settings. You notice here I'm using a little bit different wedge, a little bit higher wedge. This is 55%, which is actually the max, and that's just to give a little bit more security. The Xfinity car for me turns a little bit easier, so I increased the wedge just to give it a little bit more stability, particularly on corner entry and mid corner. Looking at the spring settings, a little bit more spring in the rear in particular, 450 in the left rear, 470 in the right rear. You can actually use higher than that, but it tends to get loose over a long run, so I backed off of that a little bit. You may need to back off even more, just depending on your driving style. Tire settings, not a whole lot different here. I dropped the left rear just a little bit, but that's certainly up to you. That's a feel thing more than anything else. Miscellaneous settings, you can see I'm using a little bit different camber, +5 on the left front, -3 on the right front. A little extra camber helps the car turn a little bit more without being too excessive and really hurting the tire. Front sway bar at 1.15, but as I mentioned before, don't be afraid to test out with 1.315 and see if that really helps you over a long run. It's not going to help you get more speed in the short run, but it could very likely give you more speed overall in a long run. Moving on to the track bar, 8 inches in both the left and the right side of the car, and that is flat simply because I didn't need the help on exit that I would normally increase this number for. In this case, I just needed to lower it overall over what I would more traditionally use, which would be somewhere between 9 and 11, just to keep the rear tires under me over a long run. Here you can see the brake bias we were just talking about a few moments ago, where I showed you something in the low 70s. Now we're at 65, just because in the Xfinity car, I have really taken a liking to dragging the brake a little bit on entry, and the 65% helps the car to rotate. Grill tape, again, not a whole lot going on here, just don't overheat. Wheel lock and steering offset are the same. Coming down to the gear settings, 471 works fine, 486 we've seen before, 463. It all just depends on how you use the throttle pedal and your overall driving style. That takes care of Xfinity. Now let's finally move into the trucks. A couple of things that I wanted to point out to you in the truck setup. Again, just like the Xfinity setup, a lot of this we've already discussed with the Cup, and the settings are either the same or extremely similar. So I want to move forward to the weight settings, 55% wedge, which is the same as I use in Xfinity, again, just to give it a little bit more of a secure feeling on corner entry and through the center. Spring settings, 500 and 520 in the rear, higher than I'm using in the other two series, and the reason for that is because the trucks are the slowest at Bristol, and they're also the easiest to drive. So I can get by with more rear spring here. But as always, if you find that that's getting too loose for you, then drop those springs. In particular, the right rear spring, maybe something like 400, 420, and see how that feels to you if you're too loose with the 500 and 520. Tire pressure settings, very similar to what we've already seen. Miscellaneous settings, camber, very similar to what we've already seen. But the front sway bar, here I'm using the 1.315. I had mentioned it in the other setups, but here I'm using it standard just because it really helps me over a long run. Takes a little speed out of the car early, but it definitely helps over the long run and enables me to use a little bit higher track bar here at 9 inches as opposed to something like 8 inches that we've seen before. Everything else, very similar to what we've seen in the other two cars. That's going to do it for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned as we will continue our support for NASCAR Heat 4.